Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, July 30th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We are going to get into the SEC today, make all of my predictions for the 2024 season, but before we get into that, I do want to talk about something that has been happening in our sport for quite some time, kind of the division between the haves and the have-nots, and it's been kind of slowly making its way up the ladder in college football, and frankly, I think it might make its way into the SEC and the Big Ten. So I'll kind of break down what I mean and how quickly we are going to get to that reality. Then we'll get into the SEC predictions. We'll first do the breakdown of every team, just quick thoughts on everyone, and then we'll get into all the predictions. I'll give you records for everyone, the championship, obviously, the champion, offensive player of the year, defensive player of the year, freshman, transfer, all of those of the year for the SEC this upcoming year. And then we'll get into the recruiting update. There is a ton going on. Auburn is on absolute tear. Tennessee right there with them. So we'll break down both of those universities and how they might just be heading for something special in both of those places. Then we'll get into kind of a Tuesday catch-up. We'll get into some big headlines across the sport, as I'm sure a lot of you seen. The Ra Thomas situation we will absolutely get into at the end of the show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for the both of us. But let's jump right in here and let's talk about this, because I think this is one of the big questions in college sports right now. Obviously, the division between the haves and the have-nots has been growing for quite some time, at least for the last decade, but you can go further back than that if you really want to. There are so many different things that are leaning towards the people that have the most money, the Texas, the Notre Dames, the Ohio States, all of those teams that can spare, $22 million to work on the revenue sharing, or can spare $20 million to spend on their football team, which we'll get into here in a second. But overall, this is a reality in the sport. And for the most part, it's been splitting itself by conference. So the SEC and the Big Ten, we know has a lot of money. We know have a lot of teams that are going to be problems for a lot of people in the NIL and just in the money market overall. Then on the other side, you have the ACC, the Big 12 on the Group of Five, where there are some issues on the money side of things, and you don't necessarily have as much. But something I've kind of been noticing is it's just kind of making its way up the sport. It started with the FCS, and the FBS was the big division that you could find. Now it's more Power 4 and Group of 5 is the big-time division. And then if you want to look a little bit further, you can get to the SEC and the Big 10 compared to the Big 12 and the ACC, and that's a division between those two. And I think it just might go deeper than that over the next couple of years, because as I kind of get into this and break down all of the different things going on in the sport, you see a headline like we saw a couple of days ago with Ohio State spending $20 million in NIL on their football team a year ago. That's a crazy number, and it's not a number that everyone can keep up with, even if you're in the Big Ten. So it's kind of a complicated question, and it's one of those that could lead to a lot of different things, whether it's, some people being asked to leave a conference or anything of that nature. There's a reality there, and I think it's one of those things that has kind of been developing for quite some time, but the haves and the have-nots have never been more different in this sport, and frankly, I don't think that's going away anytime soon. I actually think it's going to infiltrate some of these big-time conferences. When you look at the SEC and the Big Ten, you know that Texas and Texas A&M, they're fine with money. They are never going to have a problem financially because they have a lot of oil fields in their state that have a lot of people connected to their universities that it's not going to be an issue. I can almost promise you that. Same thing with Ohio State or Michigan or Notre Dame. They're never going to have issues with the money on the other side of revenue sharing or on the other side of contracts and employment if that comes up. All of this stuff is maybe something they don't want to deal with, or maybe something they're not too interested in, but at the same time, something they can totally handle. On the other side of things, you have Vandy, you have Northwestern, you have UCLA, who's in a very bad financial situation right now, that maybe can't handle that quite as much. I'm going beyond even the $22 million for the revenue sharing, going into NIL funds, collectives, all of those things. There's going to be a gap that forms. And in these conferences, I think there's going to be a gap that forms, and there's a lot of things that go into that. Obviously, when you look at the makeup of Vandy or Northwestern, it's very different than the makeup of a Texas or Ohio State. They are very much more pointed towards academics. They're definitely in more of a research-based kind of university approach to the way that they do business, especially around money, and that makes sense. That's what makes them a special university. That what gets them a lot of the money that they make, and it also brings up kind of an interesting point in the would you kick out someone question, because that's obviously been something that people have kicked around a little bit. The SEC possibly kicking out Vandy, or the Big Ten possibly asking Northwestern to leave because they're not necessarily performing athletically the way that you would want them to. I can almost promise that won't happen. I don't necessarily know what's going on in these conversations, and maybe things change throughout time where you're not too worried about the academic side of things, but I can almost promise you the amount of money that Northwestern and Vandy bring in from research and from different things around the academic side of things makes them more than worth it to keep it in the SEC or the Big Ten. But that doesn't change the fact that there is going to be segmentation. There is going to be a reality where there are, let's say, 10 teams that can win each of these conferences any given year, and then everyone else doesn't really have a shot because their financial situation, because they can't keep up in the NIL or the revenue sharing model, or they just don't want to. That's just not their priority right now. Their priority is more aimed towards academics than athletics. So that's going to be kind of the interesting conversation here, and how people approach it will likely change. I would not be surprised at all if Vandy started pushing a little bit more money in the in the athletic direction. I think that's exactly what Georgia Tech is doing right now, and some things are turning around there when it comes to the athletic department. So I think there's is going to be something that really starts to form over the next 3, 5, maybe even 7 years, because there's going to be a lot of movement, right? You're still going to have people adding to these conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC. You're still going to have a lot of questions around, who fits where and how this is going to be allocated and everything in between. So this is obviously something that will kind of show itself over the next couple of years as we get into the revenue sharing and the contract and the employment or whatever is on the horizon. Once we get into that future, we'll have a better idea of what this looks like. But I tend to believe it's no longer going to be the haves are the Big Ten and the SEC, and the have-nots are the ACC and the Big 12. I think the haves might be the top half of the SEC and the Big Ten, and the have-nots will be the bottom half of the SEC and the Big Ten, because while you do have huge media contracts coming in for a lot of these schools, and Vanderbilt and Northwestern hypothetically can handle putting in that revenue sharing agreement, they also might have financial troubles other places, and UCLA might be the best example of this, where yes, they are getting a big time media deal, yes, they are doing X, Y, and Z, and definitely doing a lot of great things to push them in a better direction financially. It doesn't mean that they can dole out $22 million in a year. They're just not in a position to do that, and it's a very, very different thing than what Ohio State is dealing with, where they can put up $20 million in NIL to their football team, which we'll break down a little bit later in the show. But overall, it's obviously kind of a crazy thing, and it's something that has kind of just been coming for the sport for quite some time. We've seen the segmentation between the FBS and the FCS. We've seen it between the Power 4 and the Group of 5. We've seen it between the SEC and the Big Ten. I don't think it's crazy to think we'll see it within these conferences. And I don't know if it'll necessarily change anything in terms of how these conferences are built. I don't know if the quote-unquote have-nots will be asked to leave, or if that will even remotely work, because there's a million different contracts and things you have to get through. But overall, there are gaps here. Texas and Texas A&M are playing a different game financially than someone like Vandy is, or someone like Kentucky is, or South Carolina, although Kentucky has plenty of money. They're just pushing it a little bit different directions. But overall, it's one of those things that you now have different schools within these two big-time conferences that have different resources than everyone else, and have different abilities to push themselves in the revenue sharing area and push themselves into NIL and give their guys, a little bit more in terms of NIL money and in terms of what they're getting while they're on campus. So it's this weird kind of thing that has been happening on a grand scale in the sport for quite some time. We've seen a lot of different segmentations as it's gone on, and 99% of the time it's been because who has the most money, they tend to find their way to the top. Who has the least tends to find their way to the bottom. But I think it's going to happen within conferences, and it'll be fascinating to see just how that unfolds. Are there 8 teams that can win it in the SEC and 8 teams that can't, and that's just the way it is? Everyone kind of moves forward all happy with that. Are some teams asked to leave? I think that's a little bit more out of the question, but definitely something that could happen depending on who that team is. Let's just hypothetically say, I'm not necessarily preying on South Carolina's downfall here, but let's say South Carolina falls on some hard times and they're not necessarily performing very well academically or athletically, and the SEC sitting there saying, we could add a Clemson, or we could add a Florida State, or we could add a someone that could fill that gap and maybe give us a little bit more. I don't necessarily think that's out of the question, but I think we're a pretty far road from that happening. But overall, I think it's one of those things where you look at it, and 5 years ago, you knew that there was a gap between Ohio State and Northwestern. You knew there was a gap between Texas and Texas Tech. You knew there was a financial gap between those two universities. Now it's becoming even more advantageous to be the one that has the haves, to be the one that has the deep pocketbooks, and be the one that can dole out $22 million or $20 million to the football team, or any number of things that Texas, that Ohio State, that Notre Dame, that all of these big-time schools can do that others just can't or are not willing to. So it's one of those kind of interesting conversations with, who's going to be those teams? Who are going to be the ones that are the have-nots in the SEC even? Because the gap is forming even more. The haves and the have-nots is changing. The definition of that, the haves is becoming even more bumped up. You have to have whatever the number is, $150 million coming in every year if you're really going to compete in this sport. I don't know that to be the number, but let's just take that as a moniker. And then on the other side, you have to push a lot of money into athletics and maybe not focus on academics quite as much. So it's one of those questions that is going to be really interesting to see unfold, because there's a lot of different ways that this can go. Notre Dame and Northwestern hypothetically are the teams that you'd be circling in the SEC and the Big Ten, but they have plenty of money. They just happen to push it more in the academic direction than the athletic. And if they change that, then they're absolutely a team that could make noise in this conference. But they're pretty far from doing that, and I don't necessarily think they should do that by any means. So I think it's one of those things that it's going to be fascinating to watch. We've seen this sport be kind of broken down into the haves and have-nots even more and more and become more specific. I think it's about to get a little bit more specific in these conferences, in the SEC and the Big Ten. Who are the haves, who are the have-nots, and the have-nots have essentially no shot to win that conference. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. This is obviously a little bit longer term of a thing, 3, 5, 7 years, but at the end of the day, at some point, we could see a world where you show up to SEC Media Days and about half or at least 6 of the teams have no shot to win that thing. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to do an SEC breakdown, give you quick thoughts on every team before we get into our predictions in segment 3. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.